Joining us now to get more perspective on these planes, we turn to pilot Steve Call. You've got to tell me, I think so many people wonder, did time of day factor into this?
Well, it's one of the things that the National Transportation Safety Board is going to examine, one of the many things. But at that time of day, approximately 18 minutes after official sunset, visibility does become decreased. And as we all know from driving our cars, that's probably the most critical time of day when your vision, your ability to see and maybe avoid a potential collision is severely limited.
I know the NTSB is on the scene. When might we see some sort of first answers from them, if you will? When daylight hits, I know it'll take a little while.
Well, the NTSB right now is busy putting all the pieces of this together.
And News 4's airline analyst Steve Cowell joins us now with a look at what that means to the airline industry as a whole. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Brooke.
Well, I have a feeling this whole situation is far from over, but does this mean American will definitively avoid bankruptcy?
Absolutely not. Don Carty, even as recently as last night, has stated that although these concessions are going to be helpful, that it is a distinct possibility that bankruptcy is in the future of American Airlines.
Steve Cowell is an aviation analyst. He tells me the decision to fly vintage aircraft over rough terrain should not be taken lightly. Even the extremely well-maintained ones can fail at any time. And those old planes weren't made to glide very far.
And because these airplanes don't have the glide ratio, they provide less choices to the pilot to make a successful off-airport landing.
In September,
the stories coming out of this crash simply are amazing right now, and aviation safety consultant Steve Cowell is joining us here in our studios. Steve, one of the things that we've been hearing is that this is a miracle that the fire that followed the crash wasn't more severe. Tell us about that.
Well, first and foremost, we had a great response by the Denver International Fire Department. It was just absolutely terrific. The proximity to one of the fire stations certainly helped. And what's interesting is we had that west-northwest wind, which really took care of the direction of some of the fire, and therefore we had one side of the airplane burning, we didn't have the other. In a sense, the airplane was shielding itself.
Let's take a step back here for just a second, Steve, and that is the fact that as many people travel on the holiday season or during the year, there are an awful lot of flights that land absolutely safely. In fact, the vast majority of them do. It's these rare occasions when something does happen that we sort of focus in on things to make sure that it stays that way, right?
Absolutely. You have to understand there's sort of a funnel process of decision making that comes into play. From the time that the airplane is at the gate, we have a lot of things that we're going to be checked. That's at the wide end of the funnel. As we begin to move towards the runway, the focus gets narrower and narrower as to what may cause this airplane not to fly until finally, on the takeoff roll, we begin to rotate the airplane. But the travel industry, the airline industry, is by far the safest in the world, and I think everybody should be flying with a lot of confidence.
All right, Steve, thanks very much for your information. Of course, we'd like to continue to stay in touch with you to find out, as we get more information, to be able to go through that and evaluate it. Thanks again.
It might make you wonder, with all these parts, if it would be possible to build your own plane.
They could. It would be very expensive.
While Steve Dyer and his third-generation company look toward the future, the ground surrounding Univair still display memories of Aurora's aviation past. Behind these hangar doors echo the stories of dozens of pilots that once called this airport their training ground. Behind me is a North American T6, known as the Texan. But this just isn't any Texan. This is known as the Double V, named after a campaign in World War II that stood for an uncompromised victory, a victory abroad against the Axis powers, as well as a victory at home against prejudice. This airplane is the only authentic Tuskegee Airman airplane in existence.
Good evening today for a second day in Washington. Investigators looking into the crash of a commuter prop plane outside Buffalo this past winter dug deep into a subject that a lot of us would rather not think about all that much. Is there a difference between the pilot who flies you on a commuter prop from New York to, say, Portland, Maine, and the pilot of a major airline wide-body transcontinental flight to Los Angeles? Well, today the evidence was overwhelming that there are major differences in training, experience, professional bearing, and salary, just for starters. What all pilots have in common? Responsibility for human life. And investigators have come across many ways in which the loss of 50 souls on that night in Buffalo could have been avoided. Tom Costello starts us off again tonight from Washington. Tom, I know it's in your reporting tonight, but we learned today this first officer was making a little over $16,000, worked in a coffee shop for a time for extra income, had to live with her parents.
An awful lot of questions about all of this, and Colgan Airlines, the operator today, acknowledged that the crew had been complacent in a number of areas. Now, all of this may lead to changes in the way the regional airline industry conducts its business. Day 2 of the NTSB's hearings into the evening crash of Flight 3407 brought a focus on they failed to maintain cockpit discipline, and both may have been fighting fatigue. Aviation Safety Consultant Steve Cowell flies the same plane involved in the accident for another airline.
It's very concerning, and I look for changes to be taking place in the regional airline industry and possibly even in the major airlines with regards to fatigue management for crew members.